feel free to chat. Okay, at this point, we're recording. And I'd like to know, and I know Stephen's really interested in as well, how many of you were first webinar in this series? And you can use the icons over here, the check if you were in the webinar, and the X if you did not attend. So I attended, so I'm going to put a check mark. So go and vote and tell us how many of you attended the last webinar, and maybe if you're not, you could just participate by clicking the X button. So quite a few people were on the last webinar, and then we have several new folks. Welcome. And a few haven't chimed in yet, but it looks like a lot of folks are new to this series. Okay, so Stephen, I'm sure you're seeing this as well. It looks like most of our folks that have so far did not attend the first webinar in the series. I just want to remind people, you may know this already, but you can watch the recording of the first webinar, which talks about the historical perspectives of poverty on the page that you registered on the VISTA campus. And we will send that link out later on after the webinar so you know how to access it. And we are also recording this session, so for some reason if you want to go back and look at it again or share it with colleagues, it will also be posted on the VISTA campus as soon as possible. Okay, so we had over 100 people registered for this webinar, and we're delighted that we were able to open up and get everyone in the session. So if you were on the waiting list at one point, I'm so glad that you were able to get into the session. We have about 75 people logged on, and it's 11 o'clock, and I know Stephen has a lot he wants to tell you, so let's go ahead and get started. So again, my name is Amy Kanata, and I'd like to welcome everyone. We're very excited that you're able to join us for our second webinar in the series, Conversations About Poverty, with Dr. Stephen Pear. Stephen is joining us today from New York, and I'm hosting the webinar here from Portland, Oregon. My colleagues Nikki Martin and Mary Rosenthal are joining me, and they'll be assisting with the webinar today. We are shining faces and some housekeeping items that I want to cover with you. As you know, the phones are in listen-only mode, which means you're all muted, so we don't have to worry about background noise. If you have a question or would like to share something, please use the chat panel to type your question, and that's over here on the side. Make sure that you send your question or comment to all participants, and you can choose who to send it to by using that drop-down menu there in the chat panel. Steve will be getting to questions when he's at a good stopping point, and there will also be time at the end to answer questions. What we'll be doing today is using annotation tools to write directly on some of the slides and to get your input on some of the slides. And so what we'll do when we use the annotation tools, we have a lot of folks, so use this pointer tool I'm pointing on to stake your claim on the page. And you can use the text tool, which is located up here. Add your comments next to name. So there's mine right there. Okay? So you'll see it will prompt you when it's time to use these. At this point, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Stephen so we can get started with the presentation. So take it away, Stephen.
Terrific, Amy. Hello, everyone, and welcome. It's nice to see that we've got a handful of folks returning us who had been here for our first webinar, and lots of new participants too, and we're all very glad that we've got all of you here today. I thought that I might begin by telling you just a little bit about myself. I currently teach courses on social policy, mostly to graduate social work students at the moment at Columbia University, NYU, and the City University of New York, and write books and articles mostly about poverty, inequality, and welfare. But relevant, perhaps, for our purposes is that before going off to graduate school some number of years ago now, I worked for over a decade in New York City not-for-profit organizations, and most of that time was with small, community-based, mostly faith-based soup kitchens and food pantries, helping them better manage and expand their programs. So I've got lots of experience with literally hundreds of different kinds of small and mid-sized organizations, for the most part throughout New York City. So I likely have at least some sense of the kinds of organizations that many of you are likely to be placed in and the kinds of challenges that you're facing. What I hope we'll be able to show over the course of the hour or so we have together today is some of the ways in which having some basic information about poverty data at hand can help you in your day-to-day work. So what the goals we have for us today. So we hope that by the end of the webinar you'll be able to do the following. Now, as you can see from this list of objectives here, our mission for today is mostly description. To understand poverty rates in the United States, how they're constructed, and how they vary from group to group and place to place, so that in our next webinar, which we're thinking of as sort of a continuation of this one, we can then turn our attention to explaining why people are poor. And in that one, we'll look specifically at the effects of the Great Recession and why so many people are poor today, but we'll use that as a way to try to explain other moments of American poverty too. But those explanations are going to be mostly for later, so we'll need to be patient. And today, what we want you all to be able to do is to describe the population of people living in poverty in the United States. A place to start. By the end of the session, we hope that at minimum, you'll know the importance of each of these numbers. Now, at this point, you might want to write them down or call up a notepad, say, on your computer and make a list of them there. And now you're looking at that dull list of numbers and pondering maybe what they might refer to, I want to offer something of a very gentle warning and some reassurance. We'll be reviewing a lot of data today. We'll be looking at charts and graphs with lots of numbers. Now, most of them you'll find, I hope, are fairly basic, but some of them are going to be a bit more complicated. Now, I will, for each of those slides, highlight what I think is most important for the purposes of our discussion today, and you shouldn't feel as if you need to take in everything all at once. We'll host the webinar to the VISTA campus soon after it's concluded, so you'll have the slides available for reference if you want to go back. And you'll be able, at least at a couple of points over the course of the session today, to ask some questions. So be looking at many numbers in addition to the ones above, but if we do our jobs right, and I do my job right, it should all make sense. Alrighty then. So let's begin with this by way of a little bit of larger context. And what you're looking at here is American poverty rates compared to poverty in other rich democracies, for the most part for the year 2004, or for the closest year for which we have reliable data, and that's that number in parentheses next to the country name over on the left is the year from which those data are taken. Now, the pattern that you see here is very consistent for a very long period of time. The United States has higher rates of poverty than do most, but not all, but most other comparable nations, and we've got much higher rates than some, right? Compare the United States rate of 12.4% in 2004, look all the way down to the bottom to Denmark and Sweden at 5.6%. Right, almost twice as high, almost twice as much poverty as some other countries. So just sort of to keep this in the back of your mind, particularly when we turn our attention to possible explanations for poverty in the United States, since we'll want to ultimately figure out not just why some Americans live in poverty, but what so many more do than other rich democracies. let's turn just to the United States. You're looking here, right, at two different sets of numbers at two different trends. Right? Top chart is showing you the number of people in poverty from 1959. That's that number all the way to the left at the bottom. Right, all the way through till 2010. That's the most recent year for which we have census data. We won't have numbers on 2011 until somewhere in the fall of this current year of 2012. So look at that top, right? That number of poverty. In 2010, there were over 46 million Americans living in poverty, right? That's the most ever. And quite a bit more than that 39.5 million who were living in poverty in 1959. And 1959 is the first year for which we have data that are roughly consistent produced by the Census Bureau. But at some level, that's not necessarily a fair comparison, right? But sure, we have more people living in poverty today than we did in 1959, but we have more people in almost every category than we did in 1959, since we have so many more people overall, which is why in most instances when you're looking at poverty data and other kinds of data for that matter, you're much more likely to be looking at percentages. What percentage of the population is living in poverty, because that's a number that's comparable from year to year. So, as you see here, right, 15.1%, right, 15.1% of all Americans were living in poverty in 2010 is when we look at the percentage, in fact, lower than in 1959 at 22.4%, but also higher than it was in 1973. 1973 is the lowest poverty rate for any year for which we have official data, 11.1% in 1973, 15.1% in 2010. So there are all sorts of things that you might pay attention to here. I think there's all sorts of useful and for me, very interesting information here. First, I just want to draw your attention to a couple of things. First of all, you'll be seeing this in lots of the data that we look at. See these shaded areas? Those are periods of recession. When the economy slows down or when the economy declines, you'll see a little bar in the chart that shows you those periods. That's useful information, right? If you see a spike in poverty, right, in periods, you'll see very often that corresponds with periods of recession when the overall economy is slowing down. Right. So, right, here's a period that we've been referring to as the Great Recession. Right, notice the very large spike in the numbers of people who are poor. Now I'm officially cluttering up with too much stuff here. Let me see if I can erase some things. Oh, good. Right, you'll see an increase here, but the percentage increase, whoops, I grabbed the wrong tool. There we go. Percentage increase, right, not as steep as the number increase, but you see a spike in the most recent period thanks to the recession. Right, and the last thing that I want to point out here is this, that, right, this is 1959, remember, all the way here to the left. Notice that this sharp decline in poverty, bringing us eventually to 1973, precedes the one poverty programs of the mid-1960s. Notice that poverty continues to decline at a fairly quick rate after those war on poverty programs, but in fact this decline precedes the war on poverty, suggesting perhaps that there's something else going on in the larger economy that may be affecting poverty rates in the 1950s and 1960s, that accelerated till we get to the 1970s. And then finally, right, this is that 15% on your list. 9% is the overall, whoops, poverty rate. Did I just, I think I just did that, yes. Maybe for saving me from myself. 15% poverty rate, 2010, you know that off the top of your head, right? How many people are poor for the most recent year we have census data? 15% of population overall. All right, let's turn our attention to the next slide. Here, instead of looking at how poverty has varied over time and what poverty was last year overall, we're looking at how poverty rates differ geographically. Right now, notice is much more prevalent in the South, in the North, region of Michigan and Georgia. A region that anyways was the whose poverty jump-started the war on poverty itself under the Kennedy administration. Historically been one of the poorest areas in the United States, and Michigan in large part thanks to the collapse of the larger economy and secondarily to the auto industry in Detroit. Is thought of as a problem of the North, and particularly of those large industrial cities or post-industrial cities of the Northeast. I think the first thing that you should know is that that's by and large not true. Poverty deeper in the South. In fact, if we look at census data and what they call non-metro poverty, poverty in suburban areas, which in 2000 was about 8%, it was 12%. Up from 8% in 2000. If we look at metro poverty in suburban areas and rural areas, you'll see much higher incidences of poverty than you will in the North. And this comes as a surprise to lots of people who have learned to associate poverty with big cities in all sorts of kinds of ways. Now, we're looking at this map here, and let me get rid of the mess that I've made, just to get a sense as to where you all are coming from. What we'd like you to do is to simply use that pointer tool that Amy was pointing to earlier, right? And thank you, Amy, she's now pointing to it again. And simply point to us where you are in the nation. Terrific. Rebecca, thank you. Is in Oregon. Oh, terrific. A lot in the West, a lot in the East, it looks like. A little in the South, not too much in the Midwest. Representing Texas. Jacobus and Ashley in Hawaii, welcome, that's great. Melissa in Alaska, that's terrific. Okay, that really is mostly just to satisfy all of our Purian interest and to see where it is that everybody's come from. And nice to see such geographic variety. We've clearly got good representation, especially for the East and West coasts. What I'd like to think about, and we're not going to do anything with this information, but I hope that you on your own will do something with it after the webinar is over, to ask yourself whether you know what the poverty rate is in your particular area or your particular state, right? We know it's 15% nationwide. We know that it's deeper in the South, right? Those dark-colored areas are higher than 1610. We know that in some places in the North it's lighter. Do you know what the poverty rate is in your particular area? Right. And in the webinar, in fact, you go to our resource page, you'll see a few sites that you can visit to get more information, more detailed information in poverty, and some will, in fact, give you information. If you plug in your zip code, it'll give you very particular kinds of information about where it is that you're located. And I think that that's something that you should know as VISTAs. You should know what the poverty is, not just in your region, not just in your state, but in the very particular community that you're working in and that you're serving. You should know that simply because that's useful, important information to have at your disposal, but it also might come in handy if you are charged with, say, helping put together grant applications, providing very particular kinds of data in order to justify the need for particular new funding for your agency, or communicating with the community or others about the work that your agency is doing. If you can talk with specifics about the kind of need that is present in your area, you may have a much better chance of enlisting people, whether it's donating time or energy or money, to organizations that you're working in. So, some point later. Okay. We've seen the ways, very briefly, the ways in which that 15% overall national poverty rate obscures variation. We've seen that it obscures variation regionally. Some parts of the country, in fact, are poorer than 15%. Others have rates higher than 15%. Here, notice how much variation there is by race. We're looking at the same kinds of trends over time. Right? 1959, right, 2010. Here's the for African Americans. What have I done wrong? 0.4% for African Americans. What? 26.6%, also essentially 27%. We have 12% for Asian Americans, 0.9%, essentially 10%. Notice, again, look at the long-term trend, right? Dotted line, when you see a dotted line in data like this, it tells you that either they're data that come from a different source, right, because the Census Bureau wasn't tracking consistently by race in these earlier periods. So these data were pulled from another source, and it's a combination of other data and predictions of data. But this is a good number. It's put together by people who are really thoughtful about these kinds of questions. The rate for African Americans, highest among all ethnic or racial groups in the United States today, has declined by almost 50%, by half, right, from 55% to 28%. Nonetheless, poverty for African Americans and Hispanics is significantly higher than it is for whites and again, Asians. Right, and the way that's the 27 on your list. An overall poverty rate of 15%, for 27% for African Americans is 27% for Hispanics. The theme that I will be hammering home a bit in the time that we have left is that any time you see an overall number and average, ask yourself what kind of variation is that obscuring. So if someone tells you, and they're right, that poverty in the United States in 2010 was 15%, you now to ask, well, wait a minute, but how does that differ regionally? And does it mean that it's 15% in my area? And you also now know that it varies enormously by things like race. And let's look at the slide here. It doesn't just vary from racial group to racial group, but poverty rates can vary enormously even within groups, right? So for the moment, I want to look at just the part of the chart that's that red line that I've just drawn. Right, and we saw earlier in that previous slide, right, that while poverty rates were 27% for African Americans and Hispanics, 10% for whites, it was 12% for Asian Americans, and you'll hear people refer to the relatively low poverty rates among Asian Americans. But that 12% is also obscuring variation. It was 23%, not 12%, on Cambodians, Hmong, and Malaysian Americans, and only 7% among Filipinos. Right, and we're here. Right, notice also how high the rate is for Native Americans. Right, 5%, and actually lower for whites. And these are 2000 census data, which is why these numbers are slightly different than the one we've just seen. Right, a lesson here. That 15% overall number obscures a lot, and even that 12% poverty rate for Asians obscures a lot. You know, the questions that a number of you posed to us before the webinar, more than a handful asked for some tips, some suggestions about simple ways to communicate poverty data. This in some ways points to part of the problem, because when all is said and done, not necessarily so simple. Rates vary. They vary over time. They vary from place to place. They vary from group to group, and even vary within groups. And just to make things more complicated, the variation within those groups changes over time. Keep that complexity in mind as you think about the people who your agencies are serving and living in poverty in your communities. Okay. Varies by age as well. Just to get a sense of the room, of the virtual room, we're going to open a poll here. I shouldn't say we, Amy, who's doing all the hard work here. Amy is going to open a poll here. And we want simply for you to click one of those boxes in response to this question. Right? Which group do you think currently has the highest poverty rate in the United States? People 18 and under, children. People to 64, adults. Or 65 and older, the elderly. right? So just a moment and click on one of the boxes and let us know which of those groups you think has the highest poverty rate. Whenever you think that we've reached sort of a threshold of people weighing in, feel free to go ahead and just throw those results up there. We can all take a look at them.
Okay, warning, folks, go ahead and vote if you haven't done so yet.
Like, I don't know, I should be singing in order to pass the time, but I won't subject people to that. That seems cruel.
Okay, so WebEx is putting together results. So a couple more seconds and I'll publish so that everyone can see the results. Okay, there we go.
Okay, so what do we have? So 32% think children have the highest poverty rate of any age group, 20% adults, and 30% thought those over the age of 65. 8%, much to their credit, are willing to admit that they're not sure and actually said so. So let's go to the next slide and take a look at what, in fact, the answer to that question is. It is, in fact, children. Right? And this should start to look very familiar. Right? We've got 1959 as the first year over here. 2010 is the most recent year for which we have data. We're seeing trend lines, right, starting over here. Here's child poverty rate today, 22%. More than 1 in 5 children in the United States of America today lives in poverty. By contrast, however, under 10% of the elderly, by official Census Bureau measures, live in poverty. There are any number of things that are interesting in this chart that we might pay attention to. I want, for now, just to draw your attention to this trend. And that's right. This is, notice that red line, that's the elderly poverty rate. 35% in 1959, higher than any other group, and significantly higher than the poverty rate for children. Look at the rate now, today, right, or 2010, for over the age of 65, 9%, right? Sharper decline than for any other group. And notice here, this is a thing that is fascinating, I think, right, although I tend to be easily fascinated by these sorts of things. Notice that now I'm clouding this up with too much. Notice that for every other group in the current recession, right, this recessionary line, that spiked up, right, and we expect to see that in periods of recession. Except elderly, right? In fact, in this period of recession, the poverty rate for those over the age of 65 continued to decline, right, not sharply as it had been in the 1950s and 60s, but nonetheless continued to decline, and that's only true for that group. Now, again, the explanations we reserve for the most part for the next webinar. I do want to point your attention to one sort of large set of things that's going on here, and there are a number of kinds of explanations for why the poverty rate of the elderly is so much lower and why it's continued to decline. The shortest answer to that is security and Medicare. And in for much more elaborate kinds of income support and healthcare support programs available to those over the age of 65, we have been effective not only at reducing the poverty rate of older Americans, but even in periods of recession, the poverty rate of older Americans. Right? And by the way, right, that 22 and that 9 on your list of numbers. Right? So you've got the overall poverty rate of 15%, you've got a poverty rate of 27% for African Americans and Latinos, 22% for children, 9% for the elderly. And let's tick on to the next slide. You can see, again, sorry.
Hi, this is Nikki. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we had a question that was quite specific to the last slide, and I was wondering if you would be willing to entertain it.
Yeah, totally. Go ahead.
Thanks. Tom is wondering why the poverty rate for children tends to fluctuate much more than for other groups. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Many thoughts about that, and it's a terrific question. I'm gonna defer it So maybe later in the webinar, when we know we've got a block of time for me to answer that a little bit, or make sure that we pay attention to that in the subsequent webinar. It's a terrific question. It requires a little bit of elaboration and laying some groundwork to make it make sense. I don't want to lose the thread of what it is that we're doing right now. So Tom can be patient. I promise that if not later today, then we'll get to it in the next webinar.
Sounds great. Thanks.
All right. Okay. So we've seen, right, that poverty varies. It varies geographically. It varies by race. It varies by age. Now we're looking at the confluence of two of those factors, right? We're looking at age and race, right? So we see that children have much higher poverty rates than any other group in the United States. If we start to look at how that breaks down by race, we see as much or more variation as we've seen in any other categories, right? At how much higher the child poverty rate is for African Americans and Hispanics, some 30 percentage point higher than it is for white children in many years, right? 9%, I've done it again, 9% versus 12%. Again, what can obscure in human terms. No one you meet is an average. No one in your community is an average. No one your agency serves is an average. Each of them will have their own particular kinds of experiences. So you should be able to describe the race in your area and how that varies, right? Neighborhood to neighborhood, from race to race, from gender to gender, from age to age. But assumptions that everybody in need of assistance is going to neatly fit into what you identify to be their prescribed category. So that's still more variation. And here, and this was a particular request that came from a couple of people in the questions beforehand, right, looking at how poverty rates vary now by family structure, by family type, right? And here you can see that poverty among female-headed households is some 40%, right, 41% if we're rounding up, 9% for couple families. We've seen fairly, right, significant declines over the period, right, one, right here, but less, right, a fairly consistent and very large difference. Now again, we're for the most part saving explanations for the next time, but I do want to say just a couple of things about what seems to be going on here. Why is it that female-headed households in particular have such high poverty rates? And some of this is basic sort of income math, right? Any single-parent household, all else equal, is going to be poorer than a two-parent household because it increases the likelihood that there's only one adult working. If there's only one adult working, it means there's only one income coming into the household, which means there's less money. Right, so some of this is just basic. Two adults in a household, all else equal, is likely to lead to two incomes. That's going to reduce the likelihood that you're going to be poor. But there's something else that factors into a single-parent household, and that is you don't have another adult in the household with whom you can share child care responsibilities. You might work less, which is the income in your household, in order to make yourself available to stay home with a sick child or to pick a child up from school or to stay home when the babysitter doesn't show, or isn't that awful? Responsibilities, two income adults in the household, share child care responsibilities. Lastly, right, not only do you have one less income in a single parent household, you don't have anyone with whom you can share child-giving responsibilities, but if it's a female-headed household, still to this day, women in the United States doing exactly the same jobs as men on average earn 77 cents for every dollar that men are paid. So less coming into the household, potentially fewer hours worked because they've got no one to share caregiving responsibilities. Oh, here's the other thing I forgot about child care. Child care is expensive. It's the obvious thing sometimes you forget. Right? So not only, right, you have to stay home more and lose income from work to care for a child, but you're spending money on child care that you might otherwise not spend because you've got a spouse or a partner who's taking care of that. Right? So enormous variation, right? Again, there's more going on here than just that, but you can see the ways in which some of these sorts of things start to play out. And again, right, there's your 40 on your list. Right, now probably be able to do this off the top of your heads, right? 15% overall poverty rate, 27% for African Americans, 27% for Hispanics, 22% for children, 9% for those of the age of 65, 40%, 41% really, female-headed households. And let's look at the other way to look at poverty. And here, looking at trends, not just in poverty, although that's that, right, blue line here, right, you can all see the sort of marker I'm pointing to here, right, 15.1%. But here we're looking at people who live in what's often called deep poverty. We'll see shortly, and as you likely remember from your PSO, right, there's official threshold. If you have income above the poverty line, you're not poor. If you have income below the poverty line, you are poor. This is looking at, right, this second line down here, the red one, is looking at not people who have income below the poverty line, just below it, which is 15.1% number, but people whose incomes are at half of the poverty line or below. Right? So you can see here is that not only are more Americans poor lately, right, not poor as they were in the 1980s, if you look at those trends, but more of those people who are poor are very poor. Right? If it means a family of 3 with annual income below about $8,200. Right? Or to put that another way, poverty in the United States is increasingly as deep as broad. Again, if you turn your attention to the resource page, you can see areas of concentrated and deep poverty as the census has identified them, and look at that kind of variation. Okay, so let's go on to the next. Right. So I think is often that poverty fluctuate over time. The poverty in the United States is generally confined to a relatively small minority, and many think of that minority as being in the inner cities. Well, we've seen, right, the people in the South are actually poor. But you can see that many Americans experience poverty over time. So that thermal measure, the data that we've been looking at, right, those census data from 2010, us data in what people call a snapshot. It tells us how many people were poor at the moment that survey was conducted. What you're looking at here, by contrast, is a 3-year period. So you can go over here, it says percent of people, percent of spells in interval, 2004 to 2007. It's just saying that it's telling us we're not just looking at this sort of snapshot moment in time in 2010, but we're looking here at a 3-year period over the course of 2004 to 2007. The snapshot number in 2010 was 15%. We look, we can see that from 2004 to 2007, 6% of Americans were poor at least once for months. 6% of Americans were poor once over a 3-year period for 4 months. Right? 20% poor for 5 to 8 months, 9% poor for 9 to 12 months. I'll actually draw your attention to these numbers over here. What you think of as long-term poverty, what some people refer to as permanent poverty or intractable poverty or cyclical poverty. There's all sorts of names for it. You can, over that 3-year period, right, 7% were actually poor the entire time. In the United States is common. Over a period, almost half of all Americans were poor at least once. Long-term poverty in the United States is uncommon. The line between poor, working poor, working class, middle class in the United States is thin. It's variable. Over time, people move in and out of poverty. Sometimes poor 1 month, not poor for the next 6 months, poor again for 3 months, not poor again, etc. This is hugely important and something that we very often miss when we think about poverty because we're focusing so much of our attention on those snapshot numbers, that 15% in 2010. Let's move on to the next slide. Because step back even further, right? We saw that 46% of all Americans over that 3-year period were poor at least once. If we look at most of people's lives, right, at people, adults from the age of 20 to 75, 59% of Americans will be poor for a year or more over their adult lives. Now, see this here on this slide. 75% of Americans spend a year or more below 150% of the poverty line. Right? If we adjust the poverty line upwards by a little bit, a lot of people think still qualifies as poor. 75% of all Americans are poor or low income, is how that's often characterized. 75% of Americans. So, lessons for today. It's varied by race, by geography, by family structure, and more, but it's exceptionally common in the United States. This is where we've been. Right, a little luck. All of those numbers should now be lurking at the very front of your head. So if you find yourself at all the wrong kinds of cocktail parties, and that qualifies as good cocktail party chatter, you'll have those data readily available to share with other people, and they'll, of course, be instantly impressed and intrigued. What we do at this point, right, since I've been doing all of the talking for about 40 minutes now, is we want to sort of formally open up the chat and pause for a bit and ask you to think about how knowing this basic data about poverty, this basic information might matter. Right? You might imagine, and as you might imagine, have some thoughts on that question. But I want you to sort of think for yourselves, begin to explore what you do with this information instead of us just sort of dubbing our own ways of thinking about this. So, think a bit about how this matters, what you do with this information, what you might do with it. Maybe you want to think about it as offering suggestions to your colleagues who are online. If you prefer, feel free to comment on anything that we've seen. And lastly, this is a good time if you want to ask any substantive questions you might have. And I'm gonna pause here for a moment or two. Me in particular is sort of scroll through the chat that's been going on while I've been talking, and what's going on now, and help me sort of pick out questions. So let's pause for just a moment, let you guys think for a minute and weigh in for a minute.
And just a technical reminder, folks, the chat panel may have collapsed when we did the poll, so be sure to click on that little arrow next to the word chat on the right-hand side of your screen to open up the chat panel. Remember to send your reflections or questions to all participants.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. This is Nikki. Steve, while folks are kind of thinking and writing prompt, we did have one interesting question from Elizabeth Lawrence a few minutes ago, as regarding that slide that indicated that 46% of Americans were poor at one time for 2 to 4 months. And the question was whether those are probably more likely one-time events or those be families or people who fluctuate in and out of poverty?
That's a terrific question. The answer is complicated. I'm going to stay away from sort of the depths of the complexity. Part of it is just that we as social scientists have a really hard time tracking sort of those kinds of patterns over time, because really the only way you can do that, right, is you're actually tracking the same families over the course of their lives. There are a couple of national studies that try to do that, but you can imagine how hard that is, right? So sort of the data on that still needs some work. With that, by way of sort of footnote and if you had to lay money, right, then you should expect that that a family who has experienced poverty is all else equal more likely to experience poverty again. Right? And think about that 46% number in the context of that 59% number. In order for us to get to the point where 60% of Americans are poor at least once, right? Imagine sort of that there's a lot of sort of going in and out that happens over time. So yes, it's typical for families in poverty to slip in and out of poverty over time. The other thing to say here is this relates to what we talk about as mobility, right? The likelihood that people who are born poor will die poor, and the likelihood that people who are rich will die rich. All else equal, the United States, in fact, has less of that kind of mobility than do other rich democracies, than do those other nations of Western Europe and the Nordic states, which surprises lots and lots of people, right? We've assumed for years and years and years that we have higher mobility rates. We don't. So all else equal, if you're born poor in the United States, you are much less likely to escape poverty than if you were born in other kinds of nations. Those kinds of trends have gotten worse over the last 5 years or so. To bring this back around to the question, right? All else equal, a family that experiences poverty is likely to escape it, but also likely to be poor again. Current period, those families are even more likely to back into poverty after they manage to escape it.
We have a lot of very interesting reflections popping up from folks about how they might use and apply this information, and I appreciate that. I'll let folks scan those on their own. We also had a few interesting questions looking for statistics of specific group breakdowns that maybe haven't been addressed, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer these or if we can provide some follow-up information. But in particular, some folks asked about single-parent households that are headed by males and single fathers, and what kind of data we might have on those. Also about military veterans and their poverty rates among that population. And finally, some questions about the breakdown of female single-headed households by race. And I realize you probably can't rattle all those off the top of your head, but...
Why don't we do this? Well, why don't we do this, Amy? I'd be happy to sort of talk about that, but I'm also mindful of the time, and I want to make sure that folks who have only allotted an hour are able to escape in an hour, and the clock is ticking by. So, Amy, why don't we make a point? We'll scroll through all of those chats, and we'll look at all of those kinds of requests, and then make a point of providing citations or resources for answers to those questions. We put together the final resource page on the campus. How's that? And we offer data and information about each of those. They're great questions, and you might imagine, right, they're a little complicated, but I'll be happy to sort of point you in the right direction if those are particular kinds of interests.
Well, we want to moving ahead, so I won't ask you to answer this, Stephen, but I also just wanted to point out to participants that there's an interesting conversation going on in the chat about the fact that the VISTAs on that map were not located in what we recognize as the highest poverty areas. So folks can keep sharing their thoughts about that. I think that's a lively discussion. Yeah,
I think an important observation, and some of this may be selection bias, right? It's not necessarily true that the 104 of you who are joining us today are represented representative sample of all VISTAs, but it is some interesting questions about how well the program succeeds in targeting people to areas in greatest need, and that's, as you might imagine, a complicated kind of coordination problem among other things. So I think we should probably move on because I see that the clock is ticking away, and I do want to try to keep us on time here. So if we could, you're way ahead of me, right? So we're poverty rates, right? We've looked at it for some key groups of Americans. At this point, right, we should think about what it is that poverty is by that official standard and a little bit about how it's calculated. So here are the official Census Bureau poverty thresholds for 2010. Let's pay particular attention for our purposes today to number for a family of $22,314. And this should, I am hoping, be familiar from your PSO. Right? The way this works is fairly simple, right? If your income, if you're a family of four and your income is above $20,314, you're not poor. And if your income is $22,315, and if your income is $22,314 or below, you are poor, right? That's the official standard. So a little bit about how it's calculated, how the Census Bureau gets the number of people whose income is above or below those lines. And this is a very old method. Again, this is probably familiar to most of you. Developed in the 1960s by a woman called Molly Orshansky, who was working for the Social Security Administration at the time, and she was using data from the 1950s to build a crude calculation for figuring out how many people were living in poverty. And at the time, in the early 1960s, when Orshansky made this calculation, the typical American family spent about a third of its budget on food. So she went to the USDA and used what they called their Thrifty Food Plan, right, which is an estimate of what it costs to buy the minimum nutrition necessary to sustain life for all intents and purposes, right? So a very bare bones diet. Right? She figured the cost of that. Right? They said, well, food is about a third of a total budget, so if I figure out what the cost of food is, if I multiply it by 3, adjust for family size, right? Because it's going to need to be a little bit higher for larger families, and adjust it for inflation, poverty measure at the threshold, right? So it's the cost of food multiplied by 3, adjusted for family size, adjusted for inflation. And we add up all of your income, above the line, you're not poor. If it's below the line, you're poor. And cash income in the measure is what counts. So it's earnings, it's unemployment, Social Security checks, supplemental security income, welfare or public assistance, pension benefits, interest incomes, dividend incomes if you've got any royalties, right? It's only cash income that counts. So, here's what I'd like you to do. And I realize we've got lots of people joining us today, so this is going to be sort of messy, but we'd like you to stake a place using that pointer on the screen and sort of walk through what it is that's wrong with that calculation. So you'll see Amy is marked out a territory there. She's now going to choose the text tool. It will, that's a phrase or a sentence, thinking of like what you think could be improved, what is insufficient of this measure. So we got folks sort of looking out territory. Yeah, it'd be very hard to read, isn't it? That's all right, we'll be fine. So ready, just offer some thoughts. And Amy and Nikki, I'm going to count on you guys maybe to help me sort of see things as things get cluttered. People pay more on rent or heat. Right, great. 2 really great points. One of the things that the official measure doesn't do, it doesn't account for variations in the cost of living, and the greatest variation is in rent. Right? I live in Manhattan. I live in New York City. The cost of living here or in Boston or in San Francisco is significantly higher than the cost of living in rural Mississippi or North Dakota, for example. The measure doesn't take that into account. What else have here?
folks, I want to remind you, you may not know this, but after you type your reflection, click something else on the page to post it. I see a lot of claims, but not as many reflections. So be sure to click elsewhere, which will then post your text. Go ahead, Stephen.
The 50s nutritional ideas are what we now know to be healthy eating. Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, the way the measure is calculated, it's not concerned with healthy eating. It's concerned with mostly calories. Not health, but the sustenance of life. So it's a very minimal, threadbare kind of threshold. Doesn't account for medical costs, I see. Yeah, absolutely. Right, that can be huge, right? If remember, the $22,314 for a family of four is a cutoff. If you have income of $25,000 and you're a family of four, hey, you're above the poverty line. You're not poor. But if you don't have insurance and you get sick and it costs you $5,000 in an emergency room visit, well, your income's not $25,000, it's $20,000. Right? You're poor. The official measure doesn't take that into account.
Like the folks, Stephen, are mentioning the increase in transportation costs, or perhaps the lack of accounting transportation costs,
yep.
and also
can be huge.
Yep.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's again, sort of use me as an example, right? I live in the Metro of Manhattan. Well, equal transportation expenses can be fairly minimal, right? Buy a New York City subway pass for the month, right? And those can be, not trivial, but again, if you live somewhere where you're commuting an hour and a half back and forth to work, you need to own a car, you need to maintain it, you need to put gasoline in it, you need to repair it when it breaks down, et cetera, et cetera. None of that gets calculated in. Those are the kinds of events, however, that can move a family from just getting by to not really getting by at all. The official measure doesn't take those sorts of things into account.
Somewhat shared medical costs. I think that's a big for many
medical
families.
Cost is huge. I also see modern age families are not spending a majority of each month on food. It's housing. That's exactly right. Right. The problem with the formula is that when Orshansky built it, people really did spend a third of their income on food. It's something like an eighth of their income now. The largest single expense for most Americans today is housing, and that can be as much as 2/3 of their total expenses. That doesn't take that into account. So there's a great selection there. Yeah, let's move on just in the interest of time. Right, and in fact, I see that most of you in some ways are way ahead of the game. Right, in the realization that this measure really is insufficient across a lot of dimensions. Starting in the 1980s or so, a group of mostly academics associated with an organization called the National Association of Scholars, social scientists for the most part, started putting together alternative ways of calculating poverty. And just this past year, for the very first time, the Census Bureau, separate from its normal report, just as sort of an experiment, adopted one of its own alternative measures for poverty. And what it did was added in things like food stamps, right? Because the official measure only counted cash income, it didn't count the value of food stamps. Well, that's going to affect your household income and determine whether you're poor or not poor. They added in the value of the school lunch program, right? Breakfast program, for that matter, right, on the assumption that money's going through programs to children is money that doesn't have to come out of the household. The WIC program, right, which is a supplemental nutrition program for pregnant women and women with children under the age of 5. Housing subsidies, Section 8 housing vouchers, which can hundreds of dollars a month sometimes, are now counted in terms of income. In the LIHEAP program, right, this is a subsidy that mostly goes to elderly Americans living in places where it gets cold in the winter to help them buy heating oil for their houses, right? So all those kinds of income went into this new supplemental poverty measure, they call it, the SPM, you see it here. And side of the ledger, right, factored in things like taxes. Tax policy, believe it or not, it counted. The taxes you pay doesn't count in the official poverty measure. Well, no, that's going to affect how much income you have, right? Plus, on the other side of that, right, the earned income tax credit, you could get a tax refund. That is counted in the SPM. It wasn't counted in the official measure. Work expenses, which some folks pointed out, aren't factored in. Child care expenses, which I made reference to here, are factored into the XPN. Out-of-pocket expenditures, the unfortunate MOOP acronym, can be enormous for lots of households. 50 million Americans don't have health insurance. This can be enormous if someone gets sick and paid child support received for that. Right, and there are other things, but you can see that this supplemental measure does a decent job of capturing a lot of what you all pointed out as flaws, right? Both on the revenue side, income coming into the household that we should count, and on the expenditure side, right? Expenditures beyond your control that are going to reduce the available money you have to do things like buy food and support your family. This does to the poverty rate. Rate in dark blue, and that's the supplemental poverty measure in dark blue. Right, what you don't see here is that what the new measure does is it changes that threshold. It raises it by about $185 a month for a family of four. Right, so it's a relatively modest difference, surprisingly enough. Right, at the overall difference here, relatively small. Right, 15.2 is different than the 15.1 we've been looking at for sort of technical statistical reasons that I'm not going to bore us with at the moment. It's a matter for our purposes. Right, from 15.2 to 16, like less than 1 full percentage point does the poverty measure change. So it goes up when we use this more comprehensive measure, but you'll see it doesn't go up by a much. But notice what happens to age groups, for example. Right, the poverty goes down by 4 percentage points for children, up a little bit for adults, but look what happens to that 9% poverty rate we were patting ourselves on the back for earlier among those over the age of 65 and older. Look what happens to the poverty rate among those age of 65. We're still sort of working with these data. Notice that children still have the highest rate, right? But the best data available to us right now suggests that what's going on here is medical out-of-pocket expenditures, right? While for the age of 65 have access to Medicare, right? So guaranteed access to health care. Medicare is not free to the beneficiary, right? You have to pay monthly premiums and you pay supplemental premiums. And still a deductible, you still pay out of pocket for drug expenditures. All is equal, older people are sicker than younger people. The suspicion is that when we start to count the cost of medical care, we see a significantly higher poverty rate among elderly Americans than we thought we had. I think that's enormously interesting. Tell is with a little luck, the Census Bureau will continue to publish these experimental numbers. These aren't affecting the way that government programs distribute benefits or anything yet. It's just a research tool. But with a little luck, they'll continue to produce this, and you'll gain some more insight into variation. If we can turn to the next slide. Here's, however, what I think is really useful and interesting about the supplemental measure is what it does, because it allows us to count all the income that's coming in from all of these different sources. We see the particular effect of particular government programs. Right. This is the poverty line, right across here. Shows, right at food stamps, right, SNAP, what shows is that food stamps lowers poverty by about 1.5 percentage points. With the food stamp program, we can assume that 16% would probably be 17.5%. Right? The effect of food stamps on overall poverty. On the other end of the equation, right, medical out-of-pocket expenditures add in 3 percentage points to the poverty rate. So the 16% supplemental rate would be 13%. Weren't for all the money that people are spending out of pocket on medical care. Right, so this becomes, I think, really, really useful in helping evaluate the impact of specific government programs which ones are more effective and which ones are less effective and how that varies over time. I mean, this could be really helpful for people interested in designing strategies that effectively reduce poverty. All right. So as we wind our way toward a conclusion here, I'll move a little bit away from data. I'm going to talk about a very, very different kind of way of thinking about poverty. And this is poverty as an absolute measure, which is what we've been talking about, but to think about poverty as a relative one. And this is a way of thinking about poverty that comes from Adam Smith, who wrote a book you've probably heard about called The Wealth of Nations. Right? Smith is one of the founders of modern economics, no less. And wrote the following. 1976, remember. This will become important for the context. Is rich or poor according to the degree to which he can afford to enjoy the necessaries, conveniences, and amusements of human life. By necessaries, I understand not only the commodities which are indispensably necessary for the support of life, but for the custom of the country renders it indecent for creditable people, even of the lowest order, to be without. One shirt is, strictly speaking, not necessary of life. The Greeks and Romans lived, I suppose, very comfortably, though they had no linen. But present times, through part of Europe, a creditable day laborer would be ashamed to appear in public without a linen shirt, the want of which would be supposed to denote that disgraceful degree of poverty which, it is presumed, nobody can well fall into without extreme bad conduct. Lovely counterpoint to all of the data that we've looked at is to think about the custom of the country standard, right? Not to think about sort of how much income do people have in the household and that sort of crude binary measure, right? Poor, not poor. Right? To think about what does it mean to be a full economic citizen, a full social citizen, a full member of the culture? What does the custom of the country, in Smith's language, dictate about what one needs in order to be a full member of the society, right? You can think of it as either the custom of the country standard or the linen shirt standard, right? That just in part because we've thrown so much data and thrown so many numbers at you that it's useful to step back a bit and think more broadly about what it is that we mean when we talk poverty. What does it mean to be poor? What does it mean to live in poverty? We've seen the poverty rates. We've seen how they vary, 15, 27, 27, 9, 40, 59. Right in this last segment, you should have had a bit of a refresher about how the official measure is calculated. And now, although, we went through that a bit quickly, we have a good sense as to what that supplemental poverty measure, that SPM that's come out of the Census Bureau does, how that differs. Done all of that, what we'd now like to do, I know that we're just a little bit over, and for those of you who need to sign off, we hope that you'll listen to the rest of the discussion at a time when you're able to, because this will be posted on the website in relatively short order, we hope. But for you who can stay around, we want to go maybe another 10 minutes or so to do two things. First, we want to turn this over to you. I'll ask you your thoughts on what you've seen, but we do it with specific attention to this question. And that's back to what we asked earlier. So what? What do you do with this information? And related, what more information, what do you want? Right? Let's do this in two separate ways. So on the whiteboard, let's have people share their thoughts on how this matters. Do the same thing, right? Take your claim with the pointer tool and then type in. And in the chat, if you have questions, comments, queries, any of the sort of stuff that's been going on, again, I'll ask Nikki in particular to sort of scroll through that. I have a hard time focusing on both areas of that screen at once. And if there's conversation that's been going on that you think is useful for me to draw my attention to, I'm happy to do that. and then we'll take a look at what's going on the whiteboard in terms of what matters. And that's, that's the harder one too, right? And we puzzle with this as well. So with that, let me stop talking for a bit, and we'll try to turn it over to you guys for a bit.
Thanks. This is Nikki. And while people are writing, I just want to point out there has been a lot of lively discussion going on in the chat, and in particular a lot of back and forth about how VISTAs and we as citizens in general can, what we do to affect real change at the federal level, both in the way poverty is measured and also in terms of the federal programs that aim to people out of poverty. So I think there's a lot of great discussion about that.
Of course, your mission as VISTAs is not to affect change at the federal level, it's to affect change at the community level. Right? Not that those aren't important questions to be thinking about, but the different kinds of missions. What I would say is that right now, given the work that all of you are doing in your communities, I say focus your attention on what's going on there. Soak yourself, immerse yourself in that world as thoroughly and completely as you can. Gain as much firsthand knowledge as you can of the real lived experience of Americans who are living in poverty. And at the same time, read reports that come out of Congress and the Congressional Budget Office and the Census Bureau and General Accountability Office. Right? See statements about the data that government produces and what's going on and how things change over time, and begin for yourself to try to sort of reconcile what we talk with social workers about as micro and macro, right? And to sort of make sense of what you see going on in that smaller world where you're doing your work with that larger macro world with all the data and statistics. Easier said than done, right? That's a complicated kind of endeavor, and arguably it's something that I'm still constantly engaged in on a regular basis. But that's some ways it can, those things I think can productively inform each other.
We've got a lot of populating the whiteboard too, and I see a lot of comments from folks that this presentation has deepened their understanding of poverty and some of the nuances and different aspects of both the demographic breakdowns. And some folks also talking about application, that they're able to make presentations about these topics and work effectively with their individual communities based on some of the knowledge that they gained today.
I'll direct this question at both Amy and Nikki. What do you think we should do in terms of time? I'm happy to answer particular questions. What do you think we should do at this point, given that we're already the tiniest bit over? We're about 10 minutes over.
So this is Amy. I propose at this point that we go ahead and formally wrap up, and then if I know you mentioned you had a little bit of time, so we can stay on the line afterwards for folks that still have questions too.
I'm happy to. Yeah, I'm happy to.
So I just, again, want to thank everyone for attending, and you can visit the VISTA campus to continue this conversation on the VISTA forums. There's been a lot of great discussion. And also visit the campus to sign up for the third webinar in this series, Causes of Poverty, the Economic Crisis and Beyond, and I'm looking forward to that one. Also, just a couple other housekeeping items. Please complete the webinar survey that will appear in the browser once you close WebEx. First, the WebEx survey, you can complete that if you want, and then once you close that, you'll see our survey for this webinar. So please take a minute to fill that out. As mentioned several times, the recording of this will be posted on the campus soon. We'll work on that as soon as possible. And you will be able to register for the third webinar coming up very soon as well. So it's all on that same page you registered for this one. So this concludes the formal presentation, and as I mentioned, Stephen's available for more questions if folks can stick around. And if not, we just want to thank you for joining us. So at this point, let's go ahead and use the chat panel to provide any other questions that you might have for Stephen.
Scanning those for you, Stephen. This is Nikki.
Great, thank you, Nikki.
Some additional nice reflections here while we wait for questions. Folks talking about they can use statistics to take them to potential donors to raise awareness about some of these widespread issues. There was another comment about the fact that, you know, some had been operating on slightly outdated information and that this is helping them up to the current point in time. And also a nice comment this from Yale, this reminds me to investigate statistics further, not take them at face value, because there are many ways to break down generalizations like the overall poverty rate. So I think that was an important part of what presented. So we do have questions come in. Will the resources that address the issues raised in this webinar be made available?
Yes.
Okay, the webinar resources will be available. This might mean some additional resources, and I think, you know, we talked about gathering some of that demographic data that folks were interested in. So, yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy enough. We'll take a look through. It'll take a little bit of time, but we'll look through the chat that's taken place and put together a short bibliography and try to give, you know, sort of some of the best and most accessible discussions of those kinds of questions, right? Particularly sort of the fatherhood question, the sort of the fluctuation in child poverty question. There are a couple of good sources to go, good overview, and then people on their own can sort of burrow down and look for more detailed information, on there.
Well, that's a great segue to our next question from Tom. Do you have any recommendations about the best places for folks to find local statistics about poverty?
Well, I would start with organizations in your area, right? Odds are that if you identify the city agencies or the not-for-profit organizations that are serving people living in poverty, that they've been gathering data on poverty, again, as I referred to earlier, in order to make arguments to potential donors and things. They probably got really good resources. The state legislature often will track data across the state, right, for all the different kinds of state programs serving different kinds of populations. It's usually important for all of those kinds of agencies to have good information. So I would go see agencies, state agencies, and then look at local organizations, service delivery organizations. Look on their website, and if you've got good relationships with them, call them up and, you know, say you're a VISTA working with so-and-so and you're interested in more detailed information about poverty and hunger and homelessness or what have you in the area, and you thought that they might be a good resource for those sorts of things. And my experience is that most organizations are perfectly happy to share that information because they want people to know in order to draw attention to the issues they care about.
Thank you. So we had a good number of folks on the line or on the webinar, but I'm not seeing any more questions. We can give it another minute or so if anyone's in the midst of typing, and then maybe we'll close up.
I can too, because I mean it's all those numbers, all that information. It can be a bit overwhelming. Sometimes it's hard. You don't know what you think about it until you've had some time to sort of reflect and ponder for yourself what it means. So if you don't sort of feel an urgent, compelling question, there's wrong with that at all.
Absolutely. So here's another question. We've had the fluctuation of child poverty rates reposited as a question. If there is time, if there's not, that I think we are going to send resources to address that. And then an accompanying question about how child poverty is calculated. One might be easier to answer more succinctly.
Seriously, it's actually harder to answer succinctly because of the nature of these things. We will post some more information. The very short and insufficient answer as to why child poverty rates tend to vary more is that children have fewer resources consistently available to them, right? we'll talk a little bit about this in the final webinar. The principal source of income for all Americans, poor and not poor, is work. Not true of 6-year-olds. Right? So you see much more variation because they are much more susceptible to variations in changes in the household and variations in government and not-for-profit programs that deliver services specifically to them. There's less that they have available to them, so they're more dependent upon fewer kinds of sources. And you see that in periods of crisis, if programs don't respond effectively, you tend to see sort of child poverty sometimes as a leading indicator. I mean, insufficient, but yeah.
Well, I think it at least is a good start at addressing Tom's question, and also speaks to Kristen's question about, don't child poverty rates depend on their providers? And I assume by providers you mean either the
adults in the household, yeah.
The structure. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's the very nature of being a child, right? You are dependent. That's the very reason that we make a distinction in the law between minors and adults. Is that again, we don't live in a world, I'm going to say thankfully, in which we expect 6-year-olds to go out and work. We used to, right? In the 1960s, we used to go out and work in the mines, work in mills, up in outside Lowell in Massachusetts. We don't live in a world in which we expect that anymore, but it means that children are not now bringing in income. It makes them dependent upon their parents and upon programs that might provide support for them.
Thank you. So I think we're close to a little more than 20 minutes past time, and again, I'm not seeing any more questions, so I think maybe we just want to say very sincerely, Stephen, for this presentation, and I don't know, Amy, if you have any parting words or comments?
Just so what Nikki said, thank you all for attending. This was the largest group we've had so far, and we look forward to hopefully seeing all of you again on the next webinar. So check on the VISTA campus next week, and there should be registration information available for the third webinar in the series. You will receive a follow-up email from me with pointing you to some of these links and the recording once it's ready, and I'll also be reminding folks to fill out the evaluation if you didn't do that. So you'll hear a little bit more from us, but for the most part, we're going to sign off now. And everyone have a great day, and thanks again for attending our webinar.
Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you for the next one.